looking at 10 steps on how to answer an F6 exam question, and we have reached on our step 3. Our first step was the requirement. Our second step was looking at the clock and ascertaining how much time we have left with ourselves. Our third step is looking at the instructions given to us by the examiner. Now what I will do is that I will bring up the requirements that we saw before, which was Peter Sheik from the pilot paper. I will look at the requirement. I've already seen the requirement. The requirement is asking me for income tax payable. I know I have roughly around 45 minutes to do this question. But the next thing I'd like to pay my attention to is what are the instructions given to me by the examiner. For instance, if I look at this question, on part A, the examiner is asking me to calculate. Part B, again, the examiner is asking me to calculate. So that means I'm going to have to do some number crunching here. It's going to be some calculations involved. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring in front of you a sample of instructions that the examiner might bring in front of us. You can have, for instance, calculate, as we have just seen. Calculate or compute simply means I've got to put some numbers down. We can have identify, state, describe, explain, or advise. Now, of course, when the examiner asks us to just identify, fair enough, we just simply go in and identify the rules or identify the points he's asked us to identify. But on the other hand, if the examiner asks us to explain, I've got to go a step forward and not just identify, but also go a little bit further and explain it in a bit more detail. And of course, if the examiner asks us to advise, he is asking us to use our knowledge to advise what we could possibly do. So be very careful with what instructions the examiner is giving you, because that's a hint from him what he wants you to do in the question. And of course, be very careful if the examiner has included an and in the question, because if he has included the word and, it simply means there is more than one instruction there. As we just saw with Peter Sheik, the examiner said calculate the national insurance for Peter and Hoshkashaw. That means we had to do more than one calculation that was instructed to us. So, to summarize our step 3, the instruction in the question will determine how much detail we need to go into. For instance, if the examiner has asked to just simply identify or to simply state, I don't need to go into too much detail. But if he's asked me to explain in detail or to advise, I know I need to do a little bit more than just stating the rule, for instance. Make sure you remember the rule of and. If there is an and in a question, it means there is more than one instruction or one requirement in the question. Plan your answer according to the scoring of the marks. In the second step, we saw how to do this. We saw how to calculate how much time we have. So for instance, if the examiner has asked you to identify something and he's given you a mark weighting of 3 marks, you know you will have to identify, say, 3 items, 1 mark per item. So be very careful in linking the amount of marks you have with the amount of detail you put down on paper. And I would suggest that you practice this with past exam questions.